After an evening at a fancy dinner theatre with Lady Freyan and Dimir, they dropped the two imperial nobles off at their homes in the first-class district and retired to their suite in the Mithril Market Inn. With Ludmilla's departure coming up in a few days, her thoughts turned to what was gained and what remained of her time together with her friends. While it had been for the most part a relaxing experience, they had still come away with a number of productive results. Most importantly, the Empire was no longer just a name on the regional map, and the four of them felt more familiar with the culture and people of its capital. They relaxed in the suite's living room, though because of a certain Countess Wagner, they ended up sitting on the floor. "Does Liane always do this?" Ludmilla asked. "She can get like this, yes," Florine answered. "When we were kids, entire rooms in her manor would get spontaneously reconfigured. Her parents never scolded her for it, so now she ends up doing it whenever she gets ideas." Liane had constructed something in the central space between Ludmilla, Clara, and Florine. Their purchases and their containers had been repurposed into building materials for a structure formed out of boxes, cushions, clothing and magic items. Her head poked up from the interior. "Aren't you actually the one most excited about the slime finery? I look forward to seeing how we can apply it to our territories." "Yes," Ludmilla replied. "That doesn't mean, what in the world is this, anyway?" "A processing unit," Liane said proudly. "As in the ones indicated in Baroness Neuer's schematics?" Yep, Liane replied. "The ones she has in her territory are serviceable, but this one'll be better." Baroness Neuer's proof of concept was already simple and cheap, so Ludmilla wasn't sure why Liane felt the need to make it better. A field of rectangular pools was arranged over an area of 4 square kilometers. The pools were lined with a type of inert clay that alchemists often use to make vials and other types of storage for their work. Effluent from the city sewer system would be pumped to the pools, and, while the water evaporated away, slimes managed by rangers would be brought to graze. The trick was in how different species of slime would be rotated into each pool. Common slimes would come first, consuming the majority of the waste. Once their work was done, species that dissolved specific minerals would have their turn. As one might refine materials through certain metallurgical processes and alchemy, the slimes would naturally refine substances in the slime finery. What slimes consumed was not destroyed, but absorbed into their bodies. When a slime ate enough, it reproduced by dividing in half. Excess slimes would be harvested once the slime finery's capacity matched the volume of its input. As long as infrastructure was adequate, the slime finery could adjust its capacity to match the needs of a population center by managing the number of slimes present. Once Baroness Neuer's concept was fully realized, the days of unmanaged slime populations in city sewers would come to an end. In its place would be a lucrative new source of revenue for whoever owned the operation. That being said, Ludmilla still couldn't figure out what was going on in front of them. "What part of this processing unit are you?" she asked. I'm not any part. Just sitting inside because it feels sorta like a fort." "Your fort has glaring weaknesses," Ludmilla said. "Oh yeah? Where?" Ludmilla stretched out her leg, poking a spot on the wall of the fort with her toe. "Eh? No." The entire structure collapsed, burying Liane. Her health remained unchanged according to the life essence spell conferred to Ludmilla by her ear cuff, so she was probably all right. "Now all of your rangers are dead," Ludmilla told her, "and their slimes are on the loose, eating up your shiny new town. I'm certain Baroness Neuer is setting things up the way she did for a reason. Probably because it's cheap and simple." Liane's voice rose from under the ruins. "She's just trying to demonstrate the potential of the concept in an easy-to-understand way. Since you already said it would work, we don't need to sit around waiting for her proof." "Liane is right," Clara said from beside Ludmilla. "A part of our job as nobles is to introduce new concepts to our fiefs and make them feasible. Baroness Neuer's slime finery is particularly easy to work with because it can generate revenues and has extremely low operating costs. Our problem is space," Liane said. Ludmilla aside, "We don't have a lot of free land to work with. Putting those fields outside of every town and village will add up to a lot of productive space being taken. Plus it'll stink." Liane burrowed her way out of the pile of their stuff, worming her way over to rest her head on Florine's lap. "From what we've seen of the city," Liane stretched lazily, "these Imperials still think in 2 dimensions. All the tall structures built around here aren't made because they're efficient, it's because they either need a defensive structure or they built something meant to impress. Everything else is just the short buildings that fill the space inside the wall. In Gelfort was like that, too. So were all the towns and villages on the way. Urban areas are built short and wide and it's expensive as hell for the people in charge to maintain. I think the underground area of the demi-human quarter is a good example for us to use, Florine said. Leanne and I went to Fioberkana a few times and it looks like the dwarves do the same thing. The higher population density does wonders for business, too. We have a huge surplus of food in the Sorceress Kingdom, and, eventually, we're going to have a lot more people. If we use the same old style of development, it will require a lot of space. By changing the way we build things, we can have a lot more people without needing to sacrifice land. Like most of the Sorceress Kingdom's nobility, they were trying to find solutions for the population growth that would inevitably follow the drastically improved agricultural production of the nation. While it would not happen immediately, higher urban population ratios seemed inevitable. This, in turn, demanded infrastructure and city planning more advanced than anything in the region. So the processing unit you were thinking about was meant to be built underground. Yeah. We already have everything that's needed to build a much improved version of Baroness Neuer's facility. How so? Well, first of all, she's using evaporation pools, which require a large surface area. This'll get worse the more people there are and doing that is bad for us. So we move the facility underground and use a different process to get rid of the water. That's where those magic items you're making come in. They regulate the temperature of a certain volume of space, so all we have to do is make magic items that heat the effluent that we're processing. Leanne rolled off of Florine's lap and crawled back to the collapsed pile. She picked out 3 small boxes and a silk scarf. So say this is where all the waste flows in. She set down one of the boxes. We'll heat it in here and the water and whatever else that boils away will be piped out like how distilleries and alchemists do their thing. The scarf was stretched out from the box, and Leanne placed another box on the other end of it. A thingy on the other end will collect the distillate that can be used elsewhere. Another product is heat. She put a box on top of the scarf. That box is whatever we run the pipes through to bleed off heat along the way to the collection thingy. You can warm buildings with it or whatever. Next. Leanne grabbed another box and a bolt of cloth. She stretched out the cloth from the first box to the new one. What's left over will be a slurry of condensed waste, which we'll drain into this other chamber with magic items to return the temperature to normal. This is where we'll have the slimes slurp everything up. If it's just this, Ludmilla said, then why did you build that fort? I was trying to figure out how many we could fit under a town or city and how it could all be arranged. That's the best part about this whole thing. It takes waste and refines it into different products that can be resold. Sewer systems usually cost money to maintain, but now they can turn a profit. It's like a secondary tax we can collect from our tenants. As tax. Clara went into a fit of coughing. She set down her glass of wine and sent a baleful look in Leanne's direction. There's one thing I don't understand, Florine said. How do we extract resources from the slimes? I thought you knew since you called Sophie's concept a slime ranch, Ludmilla said. So you milk them? Squeeze everything out somehow. You slaughter them, Ludmilla told her. You can't milk slimes. Have you tried? Leanne frowned. Yes. If you're worried about the slimes, Florine, you probably shouldn't. A healthy population would be maintained in each slime finery, and the slimes will spread to wherever they're needed. As Sophie mentioned, slimes have coexisted with humanity for longer than anyone can remember. As useful as they are, they're a species that we've never really thought of managing as livestock. Didn't you say slimes were cute and cuddly? Yes, but so are a lot of things. We still kill them for food or materials. Beside her, Clara had finally recovered. She used a trooper's towel to clean away the spilt wine. I can't believe you're still picking those things up, she said. Still? Florine tilted her head. You mean to say that Ludmilla has always done this sort of thing? Yes, Clara shivered. She and her brothers used to pick up all sorts of things when we were kids. It was fascinating when she had songbirds alight on her finger or squirrels and Bunya came over to be petted, but then she would get slimes and snakes and giant spiders too. At one point I half expected her to randomly appear in my village riding a bear. Though her brothers had tried taming a bear at one point, Ludmilla hadn't. For Ludmilla, attracting animals was the only thing that the other noble girls seemed to like about her, so she had often used her nascent ranger skills to entertain them. How long ago was this? Leanne asked. When we were 6 or 7. I guess that might be the reason why nothing normal seems to scare you. You know, with everything I've heard since we came together, I can't for the life of me figure out how you two got together. Clara glanced over at Ludmilla. Ludmilla smirked in response. House Zaradnik has always had a minor trading relationship with House Corlin by necessity, Ludmilla said, but I didn't like Clara when we met. Across from them, Leanne and Florine straightened at the revelation. Didn't like as in I disliked her? Florine asked. Yes, that sort of didn't like, Ludmilla answered. Radiant Jewel of the Riverlands was not always a complimentary moniker. Oh wow, Leanne said. So she must have been a real piece of work then. Yes, Ludmilla nodded. When we were first introduced, I decided that she was a spoiled brat. The next time we met, I didn't like the way she was acting, so I threw her into the river. Horrified looks filled Leanne and Florine's faces, their mouths falling open in unison. It's true, Clara smiled slightly. She jumped in to save me after that, though. I didn't jump in to get you, Ludmilla told her. You didn't? My father was furious. He grabbed me and hurled me into the river after you, yelling at me to bring you back. But you would have come anyway, yes? Ludmilla turned her gaze away, falling silent for several moments. I wonder, she said. You were insufferable back then. Everyone praised you for your intelligence and how you would grow up to be a peerless beauty. The only thing that seemed to grow was your ego. It was probably what kept you afloat. I gotta wonder how that kinda reversal happens, Leanne said. I can't even remember anything from back then. It shouldn't be anything surprising, Ludmilla replied. Because Clara was like that, everyone hated her. Their parents prodded them into staying on her good side because of House Corlin's wealth, so all the relationships that she had were fake. She started behaving herself around me after I threw her into the river and I ended up becoming her only real friend. And now you two may as well be married. I guess the mystery of why everyone leaves Baron Hamel to you is solved. 2. You have unmatched experience in taming brats. Was that the reason? Something that people remembered from over a decade ago? Now that you know about that, Clara said, what about you two? I've seen you two together since you were 5 or 6 as well. Funny that you ask, it started when I was attacked by one of Florine's cows. What? Leanne hasn't changed much from that time, Florine said. One day, she learned how cheese was made. Then she walked all the way to my domain to milk a cow so she could try everything herself. And then her stupid cow attacked me. It wasn't my cow, it was part of a herd managed by one of our tenants. After the farmer got her out of a tree, she was delivered to our manor. You'd think that a 6-year-old girl would be terrified after being chased by a cow, but she was only mad that she didn't get to milk it. When my parents left me alone with her, she convinced me that we should sneak out and find another cow to milk. She got yelled at so much. Leanne seemed entirely unapologetic. Florine punched her in the arm. It was terrible. I was 5 and you were an older girl, so I listened to you. After that, I just hit her whenever I thought she was up to no good. That explains why you always do that, Ludmilla said, but it doesn't explain why His Majesty's servitors never react when you attack her. Because I tell them how much of a terror she is, Florine said. They all know, and they have no reason to doubt me. Did you know that she made a shadow demon cry a few months ago? Ludmilla looked up at the shadow demons hiding in the dark areas of the ceiling. She could think of a number of ways to make them cry, but she doubted that they would be something Leanne would do. So tomorrow's the academy, huh? Florine said tentatively into the lingering silence. And then the arena. I'm still unsettled about going. It seems to be a central component of our winter's culture, Clara said. I don't look forward to the matches, but I do want to observe the crowds. The more we understand the Empire's subjects, the better we can work with them in an official capacity. I don't think there will be anything new to understand, Ludmilla muttered. I've seen how people become when they watch others fight. Maybe you're imagining some unique cultural element to the Empire that has been cultivated over generations, but I highly doubt it. If anything, it's the exact opposite. the stimulation of instincts common to all species that must fight to survive. They are presenting savagery as entertainment. This academy looks like some of those places you raised in Corlin Harbor. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a weird thing. Like someone took an idea from somewhere else and just plopped it into the middle of the city. The Imperial Magic Academy did indeed look like someone had done exactly as Leanne said, though Ludmilla decided that Clara had done a better job at making things blend in. In Riestais and the Empire, and probably the entire region, most buildings were wood-framed structures and used wattle and daub panels to form the walls. The few exceptions to this included monumental stone structures like government offices, aristocratic manors and the occasional brick building. It had the high-class construction of our winter's government facilities arranged into a large complex of multi-annexed buildings. In addition, the academy had expansive grounds of well-groomed green spaces, busts of what Ludmilla assumed were historical figures, and walkways crisscrossing the entire area. The closest thing it could be compared to was the decidedly more austere temple campus in Corlin Harbor that was modeled after similar institutions in the slain theocracy. They watched from their carriage as hundreds of students flowed into the gate, forming into groups along the way. Why do I get jealous just watching this? Leanne frowned. Because most of the students are paired up, Florian told her. Lady Freyanne, how many of these students are married? Most of the nobles are either married or engaged, Lady Freyanne said. Every noble in the Empire sends their children here at the age of 13 or 14, so the students here form groups out of their houses' factions. This naturally includes their fiancés, wives, or husbands. It tends to only happen outside of classes, however. The classes themselves are organized in a fashion to break up these groups and expose them to nobles from other factions and regions of the Empire. Even Ludmilla could see the tremendous social benefits of the Imperial Magic Academy. Nobles in Riestais were tutored to adulthood with limited exposure to other scions. Attempts were made at forging social bonds, of course, but it paled in comparison to what the academy was doing. It was not only a place for education but one where the social fabric of the Empire's future leadership was woven. Factions were allowed to exist here, but, at the same time, the students were forced to examine and interact with outsiders who they would not have otherwise. Rural fiefs were generally self-sufficient, so not only were the tenants in a fief isolated from the rest of a realm, but the nobles were, as well. The relationships between minor nobles were limited to the alliances that they made and whatever trade partnerships they formed. House Zaradnik was no exception to this. In the past, they worked together with other border houses, but as those houses diminished and their fiefs fell apart, House Corlin became their only connection. Ludmilla knew who the other nobles in the duchy were, but she and her brothers only associated with them on formal occasions. In hindsight, this was quite dangerous. The factions that formed were essentially a political and economic force blind to every other faction. When they did brush up against other factions, that relationship tended to become a competitive one. This occurred all the way up to the great houses, where a marquis could have hundreds of noble houses under him, all insulated from the rest of the nation and trying to push forward their regional goals. At that point, the only rivals to power were other great houses, and the only thing that could make them band together was a greater power. This is exactly what had happened in Riestais, where a major bloc had formed to keep the power of the king in check. House Vaiself, in turn, formed a bloc of its own, and thus the political deadlock of its royal court had become entrenched. As with any other group of humans, isolation led to ignorance and a slow divergence from the reality of other groups. Or perhaps it was more accurate to say that groups of people, be they aristocrats or commoners, defined what reality was and imposed it upon the world around them. This worked until it didn't, and by the time they realized that it wouldn't, it was usually too late to enact change. Visionaries who found a way forward for their respective societies did things that were obvious in hindsight. The emperor of 2 generations ago who had refined the Imperial Magic Academy into its current form was no different. Not simply a school, the institution actively worked to break down blind factionalism in a gentle way. Students could always retreat to their comfortable cliques while also exploring what the rest of the empire had to offer. Furthermore, the nobles who usually saw themselves as absolute rulers over their own holdings would be lent to the notion that they were part of something greater. The longer they stayed in the empire, the more imperial institutions they visited, the less unfathomable the current emperor became and the more apparent the contributions of his predecessors were to his success. There was no such thing as a human who could single-handedly build a nation from nothing. The Baharuth Empire of the present was the result of generations of hard work guided by the inspired leadership of multiple visionaries. In a way, their visit to the Empire reinforced Ludmilla and her friends' resolve as nobles of the Sorceress Kingdom. A liege contracted vassals because there was something that needed to be done. It was their job to help lay the groundwork for the future of the Sorceress Kingdom, just as the vassals of previous emperors had with the Empire. Still, the pitfalls and rough stretches on the road to progress were on display wherever they went. These groups are quite starkly divided, Clara noted. I assumed that the ones with a more plain appearance are commoners. They are, Lady Freyan nodded. Classes are mixed, so the same principles that break down barriers between factions are also at work to expose nobles and commoners with each other. I doubt that would play out very well, the gap here is too wide. Ludmilla silently agreed with Florian's assessment. Unless additional measures were employed, simply sticking nobles and commoners together was just as likely to create friction as it would encourage cooperation. Furthermore, the majority of the students that walked by their carriage appeared to be nobles. The commoners attending the academy would essentially be outsiders trying to find a place in a foreign culture, and, without support, the walls were simply too high to scale. The sound of a distant bell drifted through the window and the students quickly vanished into the academy's main building. A second bell sounded before Ludmilla disembarked from the carriage. At the gate, an elderly man with a long, well-groomed silver beard lowered his head. Lady Freyan. Honored guests. Welcome to the Imperial Magic Academy. Headmaster, Lady Freyan smiled. I would say it's been a while, but it doesn't seem all that long, does it? Indeed, my lady, the headmaster chuckled. It has only been a few months since your graduation. So this is her everyone else face. Ludmilla glanced to the side at Lady Freyan as they exchanged greetings with the headmaster. She bore a warm expression with an equally warm smile that seemed to flow from the depths of her heart. Combined with the stately, imperial beauty she had been endowed with, the Duke's daughter transformed into a princess of the Empire, beloved by all of its people. I like her usual look better. This one feels so lonely. I doubt most people would see it that way, Florian. The headmaster led them into the building. Polished halls lined by doors much like what they saw in the Imperial Ministry of Magic stretched to the far end. As Clara had noted, the few people who noticed them in the hallway lit up brightly upon seeing Lady Freyan. The first floor of the main building is where classes for first-year students are held, the headmaster said in a voice that carried down the corridor. Each class is conducted by an experienced specialist in the field. This includes those who have participated in military operations and direct combat. You put civilians through military training? Ludmilla asked. Not training, per se, the headmaster replied. Those classes are purely theoretical. The Imperial Magic Academy's curriculum offers a window into every aspect of Imperial life. Through these first and second-year classes, our students can make informed decisions when it comes to their future careers. Aside from the promotional examination, practical military training and experience is the purview of the Imperial Military Academy, one of our affiliated universities. Ludmilla wondered if the wide variety of different subjects that the students studied would wreak havoc on their class builds. This had become a point of worry for the development of a standard curriculum for her subjects. For the time being, it was basic, reading, writing, maths and basic life skills, out of fear that, if elementary education became too advanced, it might result in build contamination. They stopped at one of the classrooms, quietly observing the lecture from outside the door. Rather than any vocational content, it appeared to be a course on etiquette. Most of the class displayed looks of boredom while the few commoners frowned in concentration. Over the development of our curriculum, the headmaster said after they moved on, we've discovered it essential to establish standards of protocol for the student body. Even noble children occasionally slip through the cracks. How much does it help? Clara asked. Once they graduate, the headmaster answered, it is indispensable. Most of our students go on to serve at key institutions throughout the Empire, and observing the proper forms is essential when one regularly deals with aristocrats and other important parties who value them. Nice dodge. Without witnessing how students interacted with one another, Ludmilla wasn't sure if the headmaster had deflected the question or not. Leanne, however, sounded quite sure. They went from class to class, where topics from law and administration to engineering and arcane magic were covered. Much of it appeared very simplistic, though some, like the strange formulas in the arcane magic classes, were indecipherable. "How is the content of your curriculum determined?" Ludmilla asked. "I can see how some of these classes are taught in an easily understandable way, but others appear to be beyond those without at least basic knowledge." "Ah, you must be referring to the classes in the magic stream. Rest assured, students taking those classes understand the lectures. When it comes to the children of nobles, many have already advanced beyond our first-year content. It is more of a review of what they know and how it can be applied." She couldn't wrap her head around that. Her education had included content that would eventually have led to the use of divine magic, but, despite never grasping divine magic, she could at least understand Bohdan as well as Sophia had. "We must have walked by 20 classrooms so far," Florine said. "How many students are enrolled here?" "There are currently over 1,500 first years," the headmaster stroked his beard with a proud look, "and 1,200 second years. There are roughly 1,000 seniors, but only a third conduct their studies on campus. The rest are either attending practicums or internships with the ministries or the military. Our students are the best and brightest from all corners of the empire." "You mean to say that there are no branches of the academy in other parts of the empire?" The headmaster nodded at Clara's question. "That's correct. The academy offers a specialized education that follows after basic education. This institution is affiliated with the Imperial Universities and the Imperial Ministry of Magic," Clara said. "Do you have similar affiliations with the educational organizations that provide this basic education around the empire?" No, the headmaster replied. "Students come from disparate backgrounds. The nobles are privately tutored. Commoners either come from schools run by the temples or learn from their parents." "Are all citizens allowed to enroll at the Imperial Magic Academy?" "There is a registration process, of course. Those who pay full tuition must also pass a basic examination. An advanced examination exists for those who require subsidized education, to ensure the government's funding is well spent, you see. Prospective students identified to possess great talent receive scholarships that pay for their entire education. Those who have their education paid for by the empire are of course expected to serve in the ministries or the military." Her friend's expression did not change as the headmaster answered her questions, but Ludmilla imagined Clara reaching out to strangle the stuffy old man with his own beard. Leanne kept glancing at Clara as if anticipating just that. A commoner's education was inexorably bound with the livelihoods of their families. Regardless of vocation, children started helping out around the household as soon as they could walk and communicate properly. If it was required, they would be taught to read and write. Lucky villages had temple schools. Most apprenticeships started by the age of 12 and as early as 6. Spares be they noble or commoner, were left out in the cold if deemed a liability. In short, most people started working before the age that the academy accepted students, and the vast majority certainly could not afford to enroll. Though the headmaster presented things in a pleasant-sounding package, what he described was essentially a school that catered to the privileged few. The empire advertised itself as a nation where personal merit and talent were appropriately recognized, but Ludmilla still couldn't see how this was the case. Success and failure were still largely dictated by the ruling class. They were simply reorganizing their elites into those who would fall in line with the absolute authority of the imperial house. Granted, what the Imperial Magic Academy offered was a far cry better than what was available in Riestais, which was nothing at all, but the realities of the Imperial Academy of Magic were nowhere remotely near the universal education that Urialpha strove to establish in the Sorceress Kingdom. In Warden's Vale, elementary education was mandatory for every subject and it was funded by domain revenues. They were still trying to work out the intricacies of vocational training, but advanced education would be provided for in the same manner. Admittedly, her situation was wildly different from the Empire's, but the headmaster made it sound like the status quo was perfectly acceptable. Like so many imperial citizens, he believed that those with ability would naturally rise to the top on their own despite disparate circumstances. Everyone else was simply an uninteresting productive element that required no additional investment. The pride in the headmaster's tone rose as they ascended the wide stairwell to the second floor of the academy's main building. Upon reaching the top, the atmosphere seemed to change. "This is kinda interesting, I guess? They're getting very aggressive here." Structurally speaking, there was little difference from what they saw on the first floor. What was presented along the hallways, however, was as Florian termed aggressive. Ludmilla walked over to examine a poster nearby. It was roughly as tall as she was, portraying the gallant figure of a stylish imperial knight wielding a shining spear atop a well-groomed steed in equally stylish tack. With a panoramic backdrop of the Azalisia Mountains behind him, the man gazed out at a distant something with a resolute expression. "Do your part," she read the bold script of the poster softly. "Is the Imperial Army continuing to recruit even with the recent reorganization?" "It does, yes," the headmaster nodded. "Even with what's happened, our institutions need to ensure that talent goes where it will be needed in the future. The students from the Imperial Magic Academy who join the army become officers. Missing a decade of officers simply because broad staffing requirements were reduced would be problematic in the long term. The same is true for any organization, but, unlike a rural fee-for business that can readily supplement their needs from a pool of derelicts, our students are a precious and rare commodity carefully raised." "Okay, I thought Clara was gonna strangle this guy, but I might just beat her to it. Does he think that putting a hammer in the hand of a random person magically turns them into a master artisan?" "Many people do think like that, but his attitude is disappointing coming from the head of a highly lauded educational institution. It is as if he thinks that everything will work perfectly as long as there is a competent person at the top." They already had a sense that something along those lines was going on, but the headmaster's callous statement cast an unsettling shadow on the already disconcerting nature of the Baharuth Empire. While it was understandable that people could perceive success and failure as absolute measures of quality without considering everything that went into the result, the mass dehumanization conveyed in the headmaster's words was something else entirely. As they continued down the hallway, the posters plastered regularly along the walls of the corridor turned their path into what seemed an oppressive marketing effort. Every Imperial ministry was represented, though it felt as if the Imperial Army and the Imperial Magic Academy made up for almost half of the advertising. In addition to the recruitment posters, inspiring Imperial iconography and images labeled as locales within the nation were everywhere. "Do all students of the Academy go on to join an Imperial institution?" "If you consider the aristocracy an institution." The headmaster nodded in response to Clara's question. "Over half of our graduates will go on to serve as nobles of the Empire, their wives or their household retainers, acting as members of the provincial administration. Of the remainder, 4 out of 5 join the regular ministries." "I guess that's why the Army and Ministry of Magic have so many posters," Leanne said. "In part," the headmaster replied. "Even with the work of the Academy, however, magic casters are scarce and few people in general are willing to join the military. Most who enlist in the Imperial Army enrolled in the Academy with the intent to do so in the first place, so I feel that the effect of these posters on recruitment is somewhat minimal. The main purpose, I believe, is to uplift and maintain the image of the Imperial Army in the eyes of the students." Every poster did seem to be made to inspire those that viewed them. Many themes were common as well. Order, security, strength, they all lent a sense of firmness or stability. As the army was also its policing force, it made sense that they would want to be seen as reliable allies rather than a threat of force to the citizens. This was especially true for the members of the nobility who made up the majority of the student body whose families had lived through the bloody emperor's rise to power and subsequent purges. "Maybe we should put up Ludmilla posters in the royal villa so the other nobles aren't so scared of her." "That'll probably backfire, she'll just get more frowny when she sees the posters." Ludmilla turned her head to frown at Leanne and Florian, who innocently smiled back at her. They observed a few more classes before Florian addressed the headmaster. "Are classes for the arts being conducted in another building?" she asked. "Aside from the courses that deal with aristocratic conduct and imperial history, humanities appear to be lacking. Literature, language, music, cultural aspects beyond what is taught out of pragmatism appear to be absent." "Everything you've mentioned is unnecessary in our curriculum," the headmaster replied. "We are raising the future leaders of the Empire. Such subjects are the purview of entertainers and wastrels and are thus inappropriate for students of the Imperial Magic Academy." "So you have no bards at all?" "None. Many of these subjects would be useful for diplomats and ambassadors. Fact and reason are sufficient for any of our foreign relations," the headmaster intoned. "The Empire deals from a position of strength." "Ah, did he forget who we are?" Stab him with a cold fact, Ludmilla. She glanced at Florine. In addition to everything else, the headmaster's dismissive attitude towards arts and humanities must have infuriated the gentlest member of their group for her to say that. What of religious studies? Clara asked, or at least those that revolve around interacting with the temples and those who are from nations where religion holds great influence? The empire is a secular state. The only studies conducted concerning the temples or any similar organizations revolve around the application and upkeep of their contributions to public health. Public health, what does this include? Healing services, mainly. They continually petition the administration to include their ideas of moral and spiritual health in our institutions, however. The temple's penchant for spreading non-mandated values through temple education is particularly problematic. Much of it is unhealthy, superstitious nonsense that we must suffer due to the necessity of divine magic. I know I'm not the most religious person out there, but this guy really doesn't hold back. I wonder if he expresses himself this way outside of his little fortress. He probably did. With the imperial administration's overt measures to hamper and undermine the influence of the temples, Ludmilla imagined that many would consider it license to openly display the same attitudes. They stopped outside another classroom, where magical applications for civil engineering were being explored. A few students in the back glanced at them curiously, but Ludmilla was too occupied with her thoughts to respond in any way. The systemic way by which the empire suppressed the influence of institutions outside of their control was more than a bit unsettling. If the imperial administration could create its own religion and prop up the emperor as some sort of god, they probably would have no qualms purging the temples in the same way that the emperor had removed every political obstacle to his authority. It was sometimes said that the laws and policies of a nation reflected its character, but never had Ludmilla imagined that a secular nation could feel so cold. No, rather than secular, the empire seemed to deny anything that could not be manipulated to provide physically tangible advantages. The temples were viewed as something like a troublesome ministry of health that was also infringing on education. Humanities were only employed so far as to mold the people into a form that pleased the ruling elite. As far as they had seen, the leaders desired by the imperial administration were not leaders at all, they were managers and bureaucrats, functionaries performing sterile, government-mandated roles within their designated departments. Irony abounded since the Sorcerer's Kingdom's undead servitors would be considered the perfect bureaucrats and soldiers according to the values expressed by the headmaster, yet the empire constantly shied away from integrating them into their nation. The chime of a bell filled the air, a sound emitted by some sort of magic item placed inside each classroom. Students filed out into the halls and more than a few stopped to gather around Lady Freyanne. She handled each of them in the manner reflected by the princess's mask she wore. No matter how many approached her, she did not waver in the slightest. Respectable as that was to witness, Ludmilla's attention was focused on interactions between the students. After a year of study, the conduct of commoners was much improved from those attending on the first floor, but it seemed that the internal stratification that the academy sought to eliminate was just as strong as ever, if not more so. At a glance, she could tell which groups were made up of nobles and which were made up of commoners, and it was not due to their apparel. High nobles left their classes in the company of other high nobles. All of them had an entourage of minor nobles as well. A few small groups of minor nobles existed separately from them, but it was less frequent than that on the first floor. Commoner students were either in their own groups or very rarely a single one could be seen in a high noble's entourage. I thought it was a good idea at first, but this plan of theirs to break down social barriers is not working as I expected it to. As I said, the gap is too wide. Shuffling people around changes little. The status and influence of these students' houses define them. They won't stop being nobles because they're separated from their groups. They'll just do as they're taught and seek out the most beneficial alliances in their new environment, just like Leanne and I did with Clara. There's nothing wrong with initiating relationships out of pragmatism. I agree, but the problem is that how things work hasn't changed. Those commoners you see walking with the high noble groups are probably scholarship students, or at least ones who the high nobles have identified as useful. Everyone else is still shopping around or trying to figure out how to appeal to those high noble groups. The minor nobles are in the same situation. The influence of the high noble factions forming in every class is too extreme. In the end, it's actually worse than regular social interactions because these students are not limited due to distance or accessibility, and everyone naturally aims for the top. So in the end the web of connections becomes broader? Maybe. It could also be that many of these relationships only last as long as their time here. The social fabric in this academy is woven too quickly and everyone has adjusted their strategies to match. That's probably why the high nobles are snapping up specific people. They're trying to forge strong enough bonds that they don't get ripped away by the next big opportunity that someone else presents to them. Ludmilla shook her head over the sheer chaos proposed by Florine. At the same time, she couldn't help but admire the insidious design of the Imperial Magic Academy. Humans were a race that relied heavily on social constructs to establish order. Civilian nobles were something like the crystallization of that order. In the Sorceress Kingdom's terms, it was a highly specialized job class with skills and abilities related to both managing and leveraging the society that gave rise to it. The Emperor of 2 generations previous, who was responsible for the present-day form of the Imperial Magic Academy, was probably not aware of the existence of job classes in the way that the upper echelons of the Sorceress Kingdom were. He did, however, show a practical understanding of how to manipulate their growth. Noble scions were thrust into conditions where they would employ their training as nobles, representing their respective houses and factions while performing functions that they otherwise would have limited opportunity to in the shadow of their parents. While it was competitive and real, it was also safe, functioning like a noble's version of the adventurer training area. Talented individuals of both aristocratic and common origin were encouraged to develop themselves in order to appeal to those in power, though what they had seen gave Ludmilla reason to doubt that there was any targeted development of skills and abilities. It was probably much like Riestais, where these aspects of job classes were realized through sheer happenstance and not recognized as such, or at least kept as a family secret. At the same time, the way the academy shook up the status quo ensured that the connections and power bases formed by its students were mostly transient. The normal way in which nobles functioned was similar to the obligatory relationship represented by the contracts that they held with both their vassals and liege. Connections were made and strengthened through trade, common objectives, political marriages and help in the form of favors. Over time, these bonds kept in good faith became extraordinarily difficult to break under normal circumstances. In the academy, class rosters were purposely structured to prevent this and students moved through multiple classes over the day. The time required for connections to solidify was minimized. In the end, the only thing that stayed the same and thus seen as reliable was the empire and its ministries. Students were pushed towards seeing themselves as the elite of the empire rather than members of particular factions or traditional aristocratic houses. Factions, of course, still existed, but they were weak relative to what one would find in Riestais or what probably existed in the empire's past. Ultimately, this meant that the fruit of the Imperial Magic Academy could be harvested by the imperial bureaucracy with a minimum of inconvenience or interference. After looking in on a few more classes, the headmaster led them back down to the second floor. They exited the main building, walking across the grounds to another one nearby. "We should have lunch before the students are dismissed from their morning classes," he said. "The cafeteria becomes quite busy around noon." Cafeteria? A sort of restaurant in the school, Lady Freyan explained. Unlike temple schools that run during the afternoon, academy classes go from morning to late afternoon. Most students purchase freshly prepared meals from the cafeteria as they don't have time to head out into the city or go back home for lunch. "I'm sure that everyone will find something that suits their tastes," the headmaster said. "The food is of a quality that matches noble standards and security measures are taken to prevent attempts at meddling." Meddling? Ludmilla frowned. The Imperial Magic Academy is a highly competitive environment. Whether the goal is to interfere in coursework, hamper a student's ability to take tests or put them out of commission for an even longer period of time, it is not unknown for meals to be tainted or poisoned in some way. It really says something when he can just casually throw that out there. Not that any of them could be poisoned. Still, as Lian noted, it was a reality of the imperial nobility that nobles of the Sorceress Kingdom did not share. No one ever wondered whether their next bite would be their last.